All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? I'm Jennifer Rolls-Roots. I'm the director of the CEBC, California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Minding Implementation Gap, Variability in Fidelity Measurement, and Pre-Implementation Supports Within Evidence-Based Psychosocial Treatments. This webinar is being hosted by the California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse for Child Welfare. And just a point, this was actually a conference presentation that the group had put together, and unfortunately the conference was canceled. So we decided rather than let the materials all go to waste, we would go ahead and do a presentation via webinar for the public. So before we get started, a couple of housekeeping notes. First, the webinar is being recorded, and both the webinar recording and the slides will be available on the CEBC website as well as the Evidence-Based Practices Consortium website within a couple of days. And we'll send an email to attendees to let you know when the slides are available. Also, to reduce background noise and any echo, all of our attendees have been muted. So during the webinar, if you have questions that you'd like to share, please use the Q&A box that you can see at the very bottom of your screen. We'll have a Q&A period at the end, and I'll be monitoring questions throughout the webinar. So if you have issues that come up, please feel free to put them in. And if we, for any reason, run out of time to address all questions, we will compile the written responses to include in the posted slide deck. So I am going to turn this over to Sue to go ahead and kick us off.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. My name is Suzanne Kearns, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Cricket Mitchell, Molly Dino, Jennifer Sedivey, and Jennifer, who was just speaking a moment ago. Our team has been working together for a couple of years now with the aim of documenting the implementation gap that exists for evidence-based psychosocial treatments. Our hope is that this collective work will be a call to action for treatment developers and purveyor organizations to enhance integration of implementation science into intervention dissemination efforts. The first two aspects of implementation that we've tackled is the use of fidelity measurement support and the use of pre-implementation readiness supports, and both of these aspects are topics of today's presentation. All of the work presented in this webinar is a result of our collective efforts on these projects. Myself, Cricket Mitchell, and Jennifer Rolls-Roots are part of the Child and Family Evidence-Based Practices Consortium, which is led by Rosalind Bertram and Jackie Brown. The consortium is a network of professionals dedicated to improving the lives of children, youth, and families through effective program selection, implementation, and workforce development. Consortium contributors promote networks of learning about evidence-based practices, workforce development, and program implementation through technical assistance and research. We invite you to check out the website and explore the resources that are compiled by this group. And here's Molly and Jennifer, who are also part of this presentation. Jen Sedivey is a PhD candidate at the Graduate School of Social Work at the University of Denver, and Molly Dino is a content specialist for the CEBC. Today, we're going to be covering an overview of the CEBC and then get quickly into our two studies, the first on fidelity measurement and the second on pre-implementation supports. And then, as Jennifer mentioned, the presentation will be followed by a facilitated discussion and questions and answers. So this work emerged from a recognition that while evidence-based practices provide clinical benefits, when they're implemented in real-world settings, there are frequently implementation barriers and challenges that end up resulting in a voltage drop in effectiveness. We don't see the same level of effectiveness in community-based settings as in the research-based settings. Over the past couple of decades, the emergence of the field of implementation science has helped provide guidance to address these challenges. There are now multiple frameworks available for supporting sustainable implementation. And although the specifics of each framework differ, in general, each provides careful attention to the phasic progress and drivers of implementation. However, the knowledge and science of implementation also has challenges in transportability to real-world settings. That is, we know more about effective implementation than is generally practiced. Some purveyors, and especially some intermediary organizations, strive to help bridge this gap through integrating implementation science into dissemination efforts. However, we know that many do not. Therefore, the focus of our research is to document the extent to which evidence-based practice purveyors integrate best practices for implementation. So our primary research questions include: what do developers of evidence-based practices provide to support real-world implementation? And we aim to address this question through use of a reputable EBP registry, in this case, the CEBC, and explore and examine the availability of implementation supports provided by developers of rated evidence-based practices to organizations and providers that are interested in bringing such EBPs into practice. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Molly, who's going to give us a background and overview of the CEBC.
Thank you, Sue. So the CEBC is a web-based repository of information on the evidence base for programs that serve children and families who are at risk for or have been in contact with the child welfare system. The CEBC reviews published peer-reviewed research using an independent team to apply the CEBC scientific rating criteria, which we'll review in a moment. The CEBC also works with program developers to obtain detailed information on each program, including essential components and requirements for delivery. We provide guidance on how to make critical decisions regarding the selection and implementation of programs, including providing tools and materials to support the selection, implementation, and sustainability of programs. Over 400 programs have been reviewed by the CEBC as of today. So as you can see on the next slide, this is our CEBC scientific rating scale. So I'll give a second for, there you go. Each program is reviewed and rated on a scale of 1 to 5, where CEBC staff carefully review all peer-reviewed literature to determine the ratings. A 1 stands for well-supported practice, and a 5 stands for concerning practice. So as you can see by the diagram, moving between ratings is like moving up or down a step. In order to be rated a 1, the program must have 2 or more RCTs published in peer-reviewed literature, and one of those RCTs must show the practice to have a sustained effect of at least a year post-treatment. To be rated a 2, the program must have at least 1 RCT published peer-reviewed literature that has shown sustained effects 6 months post-treatment. In order to be rated a 3, the program must have 1 study utilizing some form of control and be in published peer-reviewed literature. Now, having said this, 3 is the most varied level because you could have a program with multiple RCTs but not have sustained effects 6 months post-treatment. Or you could have a program with 1 study that had a treatment and control group but has not been randomized. In order to be rated a 4, this level encompasses programs that have not resulted in improved outcomes when compared to usual care. The evidence does not support the efficacy of the program. So if there were 5 RCTs, 3 or more of them did not show effect. And then if you get a rating of a 5, these are programs that either have research that demonstrates harm to clients or that there has been legal or obvious result that indicates harm. And then we also have the not able to be rated category, NR, and these are programs that lack peer-reviewed published research on comparison studies, but are generally accepted in clinical practice as appropriate for use. So a little bit of a background on the CEBC program questionnaire. Our CEBC program questionnaire is about 5 pages long, and it includes essential components, service recipients, aspects of service delivery, resources required, education and training required, and resources provided to support implementation. So every program that is rated a 1, 2, or 3 is asked 6 different questions about what resources they provide organizations or individual providers on how to implement their program. So each of these 6 categories are answered yes or no, and if answered yes, there's additional specific information we attempt to obtain from the program. The studies we're discussing today used information provided by program developers to the questions, fidelity measures, and pre-implementation supports. And now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jen Sadivi.
Thank you, Molly. I'm Jen, and our first study of available implementation support, which was published just last month, in fact, in the Journal of Family Social Work, focused on the integration of one critical implementation driver, and that is the measurement and support of treatment fidelity within established evidence-based practices. While there's no consistent definition of treatment fidelity, McLeod and colleagues do provide a useful framework which highlights 4 primary elements, which include adherence, or the extent to which an intervention is delivered as intended, competence, or how well the practitioner delivers the intervention, differentiation, which ensures that the practitioner does not add components from other interventions, and last but not least, relational factors, or the alliance between the practitioner and client. Studies of treatment fidelity demonstrate a strong association between fidelity and clinical outcomes. Therefore, treatment fidelity is a key implementation outcome. Further, there has been substantial push in recent years for programs to include fidelity measurement. It's increasingly becoming a funding requirement to demonstrate fidelity, and it can be problematic if programs do not have readily available fidelity assessments. However, there is no consistently acceptable approach for measuring fidelity at this time. So in sum, while there's a great deal of emphasis that has been and continues to be paid to the importance of assessing treatment fidelity in the implementation of evidence-based programs, relatively little is known about the extent to which valid and reliable fidelity measures are available, nor the extent to which available fidelity measures are feasible or practical in real-world settings. Cue our study. And we have a quick poll here, it looks like, as well.
Sure, I'll go ahead and launch that. So our poll question is just to let you guys take a guess. Approximately what percentage of rated programs on the CEBC do you think are going to report having a fidelity assessment tool? So go ahead and take a look at that. We'll give it a few minutes, a few seconds, and then I'll close out. We'll post the results. Okay, it looks like the voting is slowing down. So I'm going to go ahead and end the polling and share the results. So as you can see, the majority of folks were going for 30% of programs having a tool. Pretty closely after that was 50%, and then a big drop off between 70 and 90%. So I will let Jen give you the actual answers.
Awesome, thank you. So here we have on our next screen is our screening for inclusion going over our Prisma flow diagram. In our first study, we used a convenient sample of programs rated as 1, which again was well supported as described by Molly earlier, 2 supported, or 3 promising on the CEBC. Verbatim developer responses to implementation support items on the questionnaire were pulled from the CEBC database on December 1st of 2017. From there, an initial sample of 201 programs were pulled from the database, of which nearly 62% were rated as a 3 or promising, 24% were rated as a 2 or supported, and 14% then met criteria for 1 or being well supported. 136 or nearly 68% of those 201 programs said yes to having an available fidelity measure on the CEBC questionnaire. And these programs were then reviewed for inclusion. Based on our initial review, 6 programs were excluded due to duplication or not actually having a fidelity measure available for review or at all at that time. That left a total of 130 programs in our final data set that had a responsive yes to having an available fidelity measure. These programs were then reviewed for inclusion in our study using the following criteria: having a tool available, and by available we mean that it was already provided to the CEBC, or when we reached out to program developers, they were able to provide it to us on request, or that the tool was just simply publicly available via the internet. The tool also needed to be an established or a standard measure. The tool needed to be consistently used across all program implementations. And finally, the tool needed to have objective outcomes documenting how programs or a service is delivered, as opposed to just reporting on client or organizational outcomes only. Based on our screening and review, 7 programs were further excluded during this review process, which resulted in a final study sample of 79 programs to which our coding process was then applied. And here on our next slide, we highlight our coding processes here. In determining how to address coding of available fidelity information, we started with the identification of a process that had been previously used by Schoen, Wong, Garland in their 2013 review of treatment adherence measurement methods. Their process was then used to inform our coding scheme, which we used to assess the presence or absence of fidelity strategies for the current study. At minimum, even though we had a team of 4 individuals working at this time, we ensured that we had a minimum of 3 members on the research team coding each program at all times to reach consensus, and when there were discrepancies, we would meet to resolve those through team meetings. On the next slide, we do provide an overview of what we ultimately included in our coding criteria. And here, as you can see, it covers the source, type, and the frequency of fidelity data that was collected. And it also touches on the extent to which training is available or required for use of the tools. If the use of the measurement tool is required by program developers, if psychometrics are reported on, and then also if they happen to document any established links between fidelity and treatment outcomes. Moving along to our next slide, we do focus here on some of our results in detail. Results regarding the source indicate that most programs obtained adherence data from live observation, therapist report, and videotapes. And results regarding the type of adherence data that was collected then indicate that most programs were collecting or noting adherence data via occurrence or ratings that were written or just verbally provided. And it is important to note here that, of course, these are not adding up to 100%, as programs could be using multiple sources. So it's important to note here that the source and type categories are not mutually exclusive. On to our next slide here, looking at source and type of fidelity data just a little bit more here in terms of frequency, we can see that a lot of programs, most programs are using 1 or 2 sources. So as mentioned before, they were not mutually exclusive categories. Most programs were using 1 to 2 sources, and they were also using 1 to 2 different types of methods of reporting that information on the sources that were being used to collect. In sum, on our next slide here, our study found that 32% of rated programs said no to having a fidelity measure. So that highlights an implementation gap. We also were able to observe variability. Utilization of live observations, therapist report, and videotapes were most common sources and were represented equally, again, about 32% each. Occurrence, whether that be the presence or the absence of, and ratings being verbal or written provided, were most common data types and were represented equally in about 58% of each. Also important to note here is in frequency. Fewer than 10% of rated programs provided training on fidelity measures, required use of fidelity measures, or even reported established psychometrics. So additional gaps there as well. It is important to note, however, that with this, there is, with the exception of training, the coding categories were not explicitly requested on the CEBC questionnaire, so there could just be misstated that we were not able to capture, as we were solely examining the availability of fidelity information that was provided on the measures and the questions that we reviewed themselves. So we were limited in what we were able to review there, and that's an important limitation to note for our study. And that takes us to reviewing our second study, which is the focus on pre-implementation. And I will turn it over to Cricket at this time.
I'm sorry. I started talking on mute. Thank you, Jen. So for our first study, as we examined implementation supports provided by developers, we started with fidelity because we considered that to be sort of the low-hanging fruit of implementation supports. So when we moved on to our second study, we decided to sort of back up and go in a logical progression, go back to the start of a process in adopting an empirically supported treatment, pre-implementation. So on the screen, you see the wording of the question on the CEBC questionnaire. So for the purposes of this study, pre-implementation materials are any tools, assessments, or other resources that are used for organizations or providers to support organizational or provider readiness. Now you see that that question specifically says to measure organizational readiness. However, we didn't want to limit our review to measurement or assessment only, because what we're really interested in is the extent to which developers or purveyors or intermediaries are providing any resource that supports or guides readiness. So our inclusion criteria for this study is a material that reflects organizational readiness for implementation or professional education, individual provider readiness for implementation or professional education. We also included logistics specific to professional education as readiness. So moving on to the next slide, we are going to ask you another poll. Approximately what percentage of rated programs rated 1, 2, or 3 on the CEBC, do you think reported having pre-implementation materials, according to that question?
All right, let me go ahead
20%,
and launch
40?
that poll. Sorry.
Thank you. No, thank you, Jennifer, you go.
So we'll give that a few seconds for everyone to vote.
And while you're voting, I'll say, I thought it was interesting that the poll responses to the fidelity question were, the majority were around 30, 50%, and we actually found close to 68% had said yes to fidelity support. So we'll see how your responses line up with the data for pre-implementation materials.
All right, it's slowing down, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share the results. So as you can see, the top response was 40%, followed by 20%, 60%, and 80%. So I will take the results down and send this back over to Cricket to share the actual answer.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. And so on the next slide, you see our consort diagram or Prisma flow diagram for screen 2, and you guys got it right, 40%. So for the second study, we pulled verbatim developer responses for rated programs last June of 2019, and that resulted in a sample of 209 programs. And of those, we had 86, or 41% of the total sample, who said yes to having pre-implementation materials. Interestingly, 91 programs, that's 44%, said no to this question. And an additional 32, just 15%, did not respond. So let's see, so yes to materials, or saying yes to having materials. However, 28 or 33% of those who said yes did not provide their pre-implementation materials to the CEBC. And CEBC staff did follow up to 3 times with every program developer to try and obtain those materials. So of course, in order to understand what types of pre-implementation supports programs are providing, we have to have something to review. So that left us with 58 programs that we had materials we could review. According to our inclusionary criteria, we excluded 8 of those programs. And I'll again remind you that our inclusion criteria was organizational readiness or individual provider readiness for implementation or professional ed, as well as logistics specific to professional ed. So that left us with 50 programs in our final study sample, and those 50 programs submitted a total of 205 documents to the CEBC. Some programs submitted 1 document or 1 piece of material, and some we received up to 10. So there's a great deal of variability in the information we received. We did a preliminary review of all 205 documents, and we actually excluded 76 of them because that particular document did not meet our inclusion criteria. So a program may have submitted something that did not provide any guidance for organizational or provider readiness, but that did not rule out the program's inclusion. So that left us with a total of 129 codable documents across those 50 programs. In addition to some programs, having 1 material and some having, up to 10, some of those resources are a single page, and some of them are over 250 pages. So it's a lot of information. Moving on to our next slide, one of the strengths of the Fidelity study was our ability to apply a coding schema and manual that had been previously developed to code treatment adherence measurement methods in the research of evidence-based psychosocial treatments. So for the study of pre-implementation supports, we again attempted to identify a process that had been applied previously. So our first step was to conduct a thorough review. And there are many frameworks out there, many people have written about this. We chose to apply the R equals MC squared heuristic. So for those of you who aren't familiar, in 2015, Jonathan Skasha, Abe Wandersman, and colleagues posited a heuristic that describes readiness as a function of motivation and capacity. Capacity is squared because readiness is viewed as a function not only of the capacity to implement that specific innovation, as well as an organization's general capacity. We applied the same coding scheme that Jen described previously, however, our team was now a team of 5. So if we move on to the next slide, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this R equals MC squared heuristic. And specifically, we looked to this readiness thinking tool that's available through the Wandersman Center. And you can see the website listed on the tool itself. So motivation, readiness is a function of motivation and capacity squared. So as you look at these subcomponents within each domain, within the motivation domain, you've got compatibility, ability to pilot, observability, innovation-specific capacity, champion, supportive climate, general capacity of the organization, culture, climate, leadership, capacities. So as you look at this, hopefully those of you that are familiar with the readiness literature will see that this thinking tool provides a succinct distillation of the pre-implementation domains and constructs that are identified by other authors. We are actually still in the process of applying this full coding schema to the available pre-implementation materials. As Jennifer mentioned when we started today's webinar, these are preliminary data that are coming from this second study. So of the 129 documents across those 50 programs, we've actually made it through just a little over a third, about 38%. So for the preliminary findings, we have applied 2 levels of coding to all of the 129 available pre-implementation materials. So moving on to the next slide is the results from our first level of coding, and this is the presence or absence of one or more of the study's inclusion criteria. So as you look at this slide, you can see that the majority of pre-implementation materials are focused on organizational readiness and readiness for implementation. Now, these categories are not mutually exclusive. So a document may have addressed organizational and provider readiness, as well as professional ed and implementation, and you can see the breakdown there. But majority, organizational readiness for implementation. Moving on to the next slide, we then coded the available pre-implementation resources according to their purpose. What type of document was it? If you think back to the CEBC questionnaire, it was, are you providing tools, assessments, or other resources? So we started with, this is an open-ended field in our coding schema where we're characterizing, is it an assessment, is it a tool? And as you can see, the majority of documents provided what we characterize as guidance, something that provides information about pre-implementation requirements. We defined an assessment document as something that supports the determination of program fit. And a tool was a briefer, say a checklist of required elements. We also documented anything else that we found outside of assessment, tool, or guidance. And there was one document that provided exclusionary criteria for the inclusion of the target population. So that 0.8% is just one document. So as you can see, we also had a number of documents served more than one purpose. Some provided guidance and assessment, or it was both an assessment and a tool, or we actually had 2 documents, 1.5%, that addressed everything, guidance, thorough assessment, plus a brief checklist. For guidance overall, 67% of the documents provided guidance. 35% of the documents provided assessment of the determination of program fit, and 19% provided a tool or a checklist. So in addition to the subcomponents of the readiness thinking tool, the R equals MC squared, we are documenting other background information as well across the pre-implementation materials in our thorough review. So we're documenting, are these materials required? Is it something that's been previously established in the literature? Are they publicly available? What's the amount of developer interaction in the pre-implementation phase? What's the timeline from pre-implementation assessment to implementation? And when it comes to things like assessment and tools, we're documenting, you know, what's the response type? Is it Likert? Is it yes, no, open-ended? And how is it collected? Is there a site visit? Is it an interview? Is it self-report? And whose responsibility is it to provide that information? So we're capturing quite a bit of information, and the coding process is resource intensive. So this is a teaser for the full results of study 2 that we hope to be able to share later. Thank you, Sue. All right, so as you can see, similar to study 1, our review of available pre-implementation materials is demonstrating an implementation gap. We have 44% of rated programs saying no. And if you count in the 15% who did not respond to the question, we might hypothesize that a lack of response would indicate that a material is not available. That's 59% of those 209 programs. As with Fidelity, we saw a great deal of variability in the pre-implementation materials. The majority provided pre-implementation guidance, and within those guidance materials, they varied in length, they vary in comprehensiveness, they vary in composition. We also are identifying that some things that we're looking for we're seeing relatively infrequently. Specifically, those general capacity domains that are present in the heuristic and in the thinking tool are rarely identified. Now, that might not be that surprising, given that program developers are likely focused on the capacity for their specific innovation, but it's interesting nonetheless. All right, so before we've pulled together some discussion points across our findings to date for these 2 studies. I think it's really important to consider the findings in light of some limitations of our study. So first, I want to point out that the study was based on a convenience sample of empirically supported treatments, CEBC. So these are largely specific to a child welfare population. So the availability of pre-implementation and fidelity supports among empirically supported treatments within other service delivery settings may be different. And as Jen mentioned, our reviews are based solely on available materials that developers provided to the CEBC. So folks said, you know, we had a number of programs. Actually, it came out to 1/3 of all programs for both domains, both fidelity assessment and pre-implementation materials. 1/3 of those who said, yes, I have this material, did not make those materials available to the CEBC upon request. So we are only able to speak to what we reviewed, and we did not seek other sources or other information, even if we knew that it might be out there. So we're going on what was provided to the CEBC. So our first discussion point, as we've been emphasizing, there's a great deal of variability in implementation supports. And so far, we've had an opportunity to look at pre-implementation and fidelity assessment. So based on our review, there's no consistent strategy for providing pre-implementation supports or for assessing fidelity to support implementation. We saw that the sources of fidelity measurement were highly varied. And while most pre-implementation materials provided some form of guidance for organizational readiness for implementation, some also included tools or assessments. Some focused solely on individual provider readiness or logistics for professional ed. So no clear strategy emerged for either fidelity or pre-implementation supports. And there are many unknowns in the use of available implementation supports. So the most obvious unknowns is the large percentage of programs that said no. 44% said they do not have any pre-implementation materials, and 32% said no fidelity assessments. So in addition to reflecting on some of the infrequent findings that Jen and I shared earlier, very few of the programs with available fidelity assessments specified a recommended frequency for fidelity data collection. And it was often difficult to tell who was responsible for collecting fidelity data, say if it was a live observation or a video or audio review. We couldn't quite tell from the available materials whose responsibility it was to collect that data. And a number of unknowns were identified through our review of coding the thorough review that we've been able to do for a little over a third of the available pre-implementation materials. So we're trying to understand, does anyone talk about the extent to which programs are assessing fit with the agency and with the population? The extent to which programs are assessing capacity, the extent to which sustainability is reflected in pre-implementation assessment materials, and to what degree do pre-implementation assessment materials guide decision-making regarding adoption versus help guide implementation after decision to adopt? In considering implementation supports, the field has yet to identify an appropriate balance between rigor and pragmatism. So when it comes to fidelity, we may hypothesize that a particular source or type or frequency of fidelity measurement will function better than another in real-world implementation. But at this point, we don't have the evidence to suggest one over another. And what is that right balance between rigor and pragmatism for supporting pre-implementation? We've observed the range so far from developers providing helpful information to those who are very prescriptive. We've observed the range from in-depth assessment materials, capturing information from multiple sources, to very practical, brief tools. What is that balance? There is an increasing emphasis on the importance of providing implementation supports when installing an empirically supported treatment into a real-world setting. However, there's very little information at this point about how best to do so. And based on our review, so to date, very little evidence that developers of programs rated by a reputable registry are providing pre-implementation supports and or instilling valid and reliable fidelity assessment into real-world implementation. So to what extent would information learned through a pre-implementation assessment or fidelity assessment be used to guide decision-making? There may be an implicit assumption that if an organization identifies gaps in their readiness for implementation, that adjustments would be made, and maybe implementation will not proceed until readiness is achieved. Similarly, we might assume that if a program assesses fidelity and finds it to be poor, adjustments would be made to the service delivery. However, we don't really know what's done with pre-implementation or fidelity assessment findings in the real world. And there's currently little discussion in the field about specific steps that should be taken on the basis of such findings. And finally, the reason we believe this is all important is to improve outcomes. We want to be able to achieve the same outcomes that have been achieved in the research literature. And in our study samples, which are, again, based solely on materials that have been made available to the CEBC, no program provided evidence that its fidelity assessment is associated with treatment outcomes. Again, remind you that a third who said yes did not provide. And in the 2013 Schoenwald and Garland review, which we use the same coding manual, they identified that 10% of research studies reported the relationship between adherence and treatment outcomes. So we would hope that there'd be more in the real world. And although not a specific code that's being applied in the current study of pre-implementation supports, no material reviewed to date provided evidence that the pre-implementation guidance, assessment, or tool is related to the achievement of positive outcomes. So we're going to leave this discussion points on the screen while we see, we can show you we have some references. We have 3 slides of references and our contact information, and we'll make sure that that's all available. Jennifer said it will be posted. But I thought maybe we could leave these discussion points up while we see what questions have come through and perhaps what other discussion points our participants, our attendees would like to bring up.
So attendees are welcome to go ahead and submit any questions you have either through the chat or the Q&A box. That's either one is fine. We've had a couple that have come in and I don't think they went to everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and summarize those. And then we have a couple new questions that have come in. So first is someone was asking why there was missing data on the CEBC. I think there was mention that some of the programs just had never answered the questions about the fidelity tool or the pre-implementation materials. And so I can answer that one. We started the CEBC in 2005, but to be honest, we didn't add these implementation questions until I think 2014, 2015. And so all the programs that had been loaded before then had never even gotten the question. We did reach out to the programs when we added these new items and try to get them completed, but it wasn't always possible. And then we try to get them completed, as we regularly update the materials. But again, we still have a decent number that have just never answered the item. So unfortunately, those ones get excluded. And then the other question that we had that I'll answer is there was a difference between the number of programs that said they had a fidelity tool and the number of tools that we were actually able to obtain and code. And someone was asking why there was such a big drop off. So the reason for that is, we ask a yes/no question. Do you have a fidelity tool? And then if they didn't provide it to us at that time, we then made 3 contacts via email to try to get an actual copy of the measure. Some organizations were not willing to provide them. They felt they were proprietary, and so they would respond back and say they weren't going to share them, whereas others just never responded. So after 3 attempts, we kind of closed those ones out. So that's the reason for the difference between the number who said yes and the number of measures that we were able to code. I don't know, Molly, if you want to add anything on either of those, since I know you did a lot of those contacts.
I think that pretty much covers it.
Okay. All right, then I'll go on to a couple of questions that have come in. Let me just scroll up here. So we had a question about whether organizations, agencies, and providers, don't they usually rely on contracted external or customized fidelity and readiness assessment? So do any of the panelists want to touch on that?
I can. This is Sue. That's a great question. I think for part of our assessment, these were tools that were built in to the specific programs. So we would have missed any tools that were developed for external purposes. So I know, some states might have, an external person who's supporting the fidelity assessment, but we really did try to look and see, what, even if it is someone external that's doing it, does the program itself provide any guidance about what that fidelity assessment looks like? So I think that maybe just a little bit of a difference between our research question and the question looks like Vivian posted. So it's a great question. I think we would have probably missed if there were some, kind of quote unquote homegrown fidelity tools that weren't attached to the purveyor's own program. We're really trying to document the extent to which the programs themselves provided those types of supports. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything else to that.
This is Jen, and I would just echo everything that Sue said, and kind of just even reflecting on our inclusion-exclusion criteria. We were looking at those established and standard measures that would be used across all programs and implementation. So while there might be agencies and other providers that do have contracted, customizable fidelity and readiness assessment tools, for the fidelity portion at least, we were looking for those established and standard measures that are used across all programs.
Great. Okay, well, let me go to another question. And again, any of the panelists are welcome to answer this. So someone asked, did I hear you correctly? Do developers or purveyors do any work or have any data linking fidelity to improved outcomes? So do fidelity measures change to push quality ever upward or forward in terms of continuous improvement?
So this is Cricket. I'll answer that. So again, in the Schoenwald and Garland review, which is a review of treatment adherence measures in research studies, they did find that 10% of the measures had evidence of linking that those fidelity findings to treatment outcomes. For our study, there were 130 fidelity tools, fidelity measures that were made available to the CEBC from rated programs. And out of those 130, there was no evidence provided by the program developers that those tools were related to the attainment of treatment outcomes. We, and again, sort of a discussion point is, we make some assumptions about how fidelity findings will be used. And, I do believe that, that program improvement can be driven by the findings from fidelity assessments and pre-implementation materials. So far, we're not finding evidence of that in materials made available from program developers. I don't know if anybody else has anything to add to that.
I just wanted to say that one of our concerns was that we weren't finding information about what do you do if your fidelity is low. How do you improve that? Is there some way that you can tell, depending on where the issues were, how an agency should respond, training, monitoring, et cetera? So that we felt was definitely a weakness, that even when measures did exist, there wasn't guidance on what to do when you looked at the results. Okay, anybody else on the panel on that one? Okay, so there's a question that deals with CEBC rating, so I'll just answer that. How does having or not having a fidelity or readiness guidance tool or assessment affect the rating of a program as a 1? Actually, it does not. When we have our rating, it's a scientific rating, so it's strictly based on the outcomes, the research evidence. The availability of any implementation supports does not have any factor on the rating at all. We do provide the information about whether they have them because we think it's useful, but we do not have an implementation rating, so it really doesn't play any part. Okay. And then a couple more questions are coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and keep reading those, and other panelists feel free to jump in at any time. And this one is about adaptations. How do developers decide what adaptations are okay and stay within the bounds of the program? Let's deal with that one first.
This is Sue. I can take a swing at this question. I think this is a really important and very difficult question. There's some guidance that has been put out, about kind of how we can think about flexibility and fidelity. In our review of the tools, I would say there was not a ton of consideration for the bounds of the flexibility or adaptations within the tools. So I think that's an area that is going to need some continued thought, is can the fidelity tool really kind of capture the variety of adaptations that might be allowable within a program. And some of that we see, as Jen was mentioning, there's lots of different components that are underneath fidelity, and a lot of our tools focused on just, were these components delivered, not how were they delivered, or were other things also delivered, or did they, is it more like, what was done and was anything skipped? So even the tools themselves can have a hard time kind of capturing the range of different adaptations that might be being made. So I think it's a great question, and it's not one that we were able to find any evidence of a systematic approach to how developers think about adaptations.
So I'll jump in on that one too, because I think that is a question we get all the time from CEBC users. How much can you adapt a program before it's not the program anymore? And so a second part of that same question dealt with how the CEBC determines whether modifications to a program's implementation are an adaptation or a new program. And so we do this quite a bit during the rating process. And a lot of it honestly goes back to the study authors and the program developers. So how much was the program modified? Did you translate materials and maybe change some of the images, or did you make a more fundamental change to the treatment itself? that may have really affected the program. So on the CEBC, we have a section on essential components. So what does the developer consider to be the essential components of this program? And oftentimes what we recommend is that if you're thinking about changing any of those, that's when you really need to get concerned. So we always direct agencies who are considering making any adaptation back to the program developer before they make any changes, to make sure they're not affecting, anything that's going to really impact the program itself. And so for rating purposes, if it is a more substantial modification, we would consider it a new program. So if there's been significant changes to it or a new manual has been developed, we would consider it a new program for the CEBC. And so you'll see some of those rated, they'll be listed twice as two separate versions of a program. Okay, so I've got one more question that came in. And so what can the CEBC or other agencies do, or maybe are already doing, to promote the development and utilization of fidelity measures among model program developers and purveyors? Because it seems like there are some popular programs that aren't tracking fidelity, and that's a problem. And then do the state or federal government play a role in that? So I'm going to pass that. Any of the panelists want to give an answer to that one?
Sure, this is Sue. I appreciate the call to action that this question implies. I think, one of the hopes that we have in doing these series of studies that we're undertaking to kind of document this implementation gap is really creating that space, that call to action to the purveyors, to the intermediary organizations that are supporting intervention, dissemination, and implementation, to really be considering what we know is best science and implementation supports from the beginning, and build those into the strategies that are being used for broader dissemination. So I think the answer to the first part of that question is education, right? Of really looking closely and documenting this implementation gap. I mean, we all kind of know that it exists, but the extent to which it exists has been really eye-opening for our team. And it's been really interesting to see not just that there's a gap, but that there's also not really any approach for either pre-implementation supports or fidelity that we've been able to see that the field is kind of agreed upon is the most desirable or really gets us to the outcomes that we have. So I think, this work helps to kind of lift up and highlight these points. And so, and I'll turn it over to our other panelists if they want to mention, and maybe Jennifer, you might want to mention specifically about what CEBC is doing as it relates to state and federal work. But I think, what I just really wanted to highlight is just, we're trying to just document, educate, and create a call to action with this series of studies that we've been doing.
Yeah, and I think really that's why the CEBC added these questions. So it's as implementation science became more of a focus and really developed in the past decade, we wanted to be able to report on, are the developers thinking about this, and really not shame developers who aren't doing it, but kind of truth in advertising. Do you have a measure or not? Maybe that would drive developers, rather than having it say no, they do not have a measure. They would think about maybe they need to develop one. In terms of the state or federal role, I'm not sure it's the government. I think it's funders. And I think we've mentioned that we are seeing funders start to require some fidelity assessment or some needs assessment up front. But I think it would be great to see more of that going forward. One place I have seen this is in some of the Family First Prevention Services Act requirements do talk about assessing fidelity to the intervention and so on. Not clear on how that'll be implemented, but at least we're starting to see some more attention being paid to it. Anybody else want to comment? Sorry about that. We're almost at the top of the hour. So if we can advance one more slide. Our next webinar is coming up in June, and we'll be talking about race and equity in child and family serving systems. And so you will get an email to sign up for that as well. And like I said, we'll add the question text and responses into our panel, our results. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to send them to us, and we can get that information back to you. So I'd like to say thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you for everyone who joined us. I know things are a little uncertain these days, and we're all in our homes probably. So we really appreciate you taking the time to join us so that we were able to get this presentation out to you. So thank you very much.